I have a secret. If you're very good, I'll share that secret with you maybe a little bit later this morning, but you got to be good. I used to tell my kids that when I was an English teacher. It rarely worked. I think you guys will do a good job, though. Engaged spirituality. That's the title of our sermon this morning. According to our third principle, we UUs affirm and promote acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. That sounds very, very good, doesn't it? But it might prompt a question. Certainly prompts a question in me. What exactly is spiritual growth, especially in a UU context? See, the principles don't offer any explanation or definition for this term, spiritual growth. Can't say I'm entirely surprised. The modus operandi for UUs when it comes to difficult words like spirit or spirituality is either one, don't use the term at all. We talked a little bit about that last week, as you might recall. Or two, use the term but offer no definitions. It's kind of like a form of verbal hit and run. When we use words without definitions or words without real meaning, our conversations become meaningless. And when that happens, especially in a UU context, our great intellectual, philosophical, and theological diversity, which are usually a great strength for us, instead becomes a weakness. Because we are then forced to find a superficial and unstable unity by falling back to the lowest common denominators of the various individuals that make up our congregation. And by our lowest common denominator, I'm referring to those things that all of us tend to agree upon without difficulty. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with those common denominators. They are important. They are, after all, the foundation of our faith and who we are as Unitarian Universalists. But if that's all we ever fall back on, all we ever talk about, all we ever listen to, all we ever struggle with, well, actually, they don't require struggle. That's the attraction of lowest common denominators. They don't result in struggle or challenge. But anyway, if that's all we choose to focus on, then where is the room for opportunity and growth? Remember, all of us are on a journey together, a search for truth and meaning in this world. But how can UUCJ be a place that fosters such a search if we are incapable of having meaningful conversations with each other about that search? Therefore, it behooves us to struggle with definitions to words we have a hard time defining. We may not find a perfect definition for our terms. In fact, I'll guarantee you, we're not going to find a perfect definition for our terms. Defining terms is hard work. But just because the task is hard and we have no guarantee of success, that doesn't mean that we should not engage the challenge. And remember, just because we start a conversation about this doesn't mean we have to finish the conversation. We're not obligated to finish the conversation. If anything, I would argue our faith obligates us to not finish that conversation. So, our first challenge this morning is to try to begin a conversation about the definition of the word spirituality. Sometimes I've found the best place to go to find definitions is children. This comes from a young boy in Israel. He says, "Spiritual is how you feel inside. Every emotion you express, everything you feel comes from inside your spirit. Your feelings, your emotions all come from inside." This next definition comes from a young man in South Africa. "If you are not spiritual, then you don't ever struggle with things. You don't make a choice or ask, 'Why did this happen to me?' Spirituality goes together with wisdom. You have to reflect on what's happening to you." Here's another. "You can be religious by coming to the mosque and doing your duty, but to be spiritual means that when you actually do your duty, you interact with Allah." That comes from a 15-year-old Muslim girl in England. "I feel spiritual when I'm attuned to what matters." 17-year-old girl here in the United States. Finally, Being spiritual means standing on a mountain with the wind blowing through your hair and the feeling of being free. That comes from a 15-year-old girl from South Africa. I appreciate the candor and the authenticity of young people like these. And one thing that I've learned from these young people is that spirituality does not have a narrow definition. Each one of these responses took a different angle on the concept, and I certainly can't say that any of them were wrong or incorrect. Author Janet Parichin actually identifies several different varieties of spirituality, including personal, communal, organizational, and environmental. She also identifies a type of spirituality called engaged spirituality. Now, Parichin's definition of this term has many components, but of special interest to us this morning is this. She writes that engaged spirituality is engagement in activities that move the world toward peace, justice, greater compassion, and wholeness. The reason it's called engaged spirituality is because this type of spiritual activity requires us to remain engaged with the world and with each other. It requires us to stay connected. It disallows us from running away and hiding when things get scary or tough. This type of spirituality requires a very special kind of person to give life to it. It requires a superhero. Superman is perhaps my favorite comic book superhero of all time. He's up there. Not because of all his amazing powers. Although if we're being honest, Superman seriously has the best power set of any superhero out there, right? He can do anything, right? Is there something Superman can't do? I don't think so. So he's got the best superpowers, but that's not why I like him so much. And it's not because he was raised in Kansas and graduated to Jayhawk like me. That certainly helps. No, the reason Superman is my favorite superhero from a comic book is because of how he chooses to serve humanity for good, a choice that required him to remain ever engaged and connected to humanity. See, it's not Superman's superpowers that made him a hero. It's what he chose to do with the power he had that made him a hero. And I think that bears repeating. It's not Superman's superpowers that made him a hero. It's what he chose to do with the power he had that made him a hero, and that is a choice that each and every one of us can share today. People make a mistake if they think Superman had it easy just because he had all these awesome superpowers. Remember, Superman was born of tragedy. He never knew his biological family. His entire planet was destroyed. He was an orphan. He was literally alone in the universe. For his entire childhood, he knew he was different from everyone else. He was an outsider. His entire life, he was forced to conceal a lie about himself. These are all pretty heavy things. It would have been rather easy for Superman to have allowed all that pain to take root in his heart, make him turn away from all the people that on a daily basis reminded him of how different and alone he was. Or worse, he could have allowed that pain to twist him up inside, make him use his powers to lash out at other people. He could just as easily have become a supervillain instead of a superhero. Because remember, supervillains have superpowers too. It's not the superpowers that make you a hero. It's how you choose to use that power. Superman made a choice to be a hero. Instead of letting his pain twist him up inside, instead of choosing to be a victim and using that as an excuse to victimize others, Superman sublimated his pain. He used it as fuel to make the world a better place. His personal suffering helped him to empathize with the pain of others. And he dedicated himself to a life of shielding and saving others, innocent people, from unnecessary and unjust pain. Another super thing about the choices Superman made, he chose to serve humanity in his spare time. Superman didn't make any money being Superman, as the song we just listened to suggests. See, unlike Batman, aka Bruce Wayne, unlike Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, you can tell I'm a nerd, right? I love comic books. Unlike Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark, Clark Kent wasn't a billionaire. Clark Kent didn't inherit a fortune from his adoptive father, a poor farmer in Kansas. When Superman went to the grocery store to buy his food for the week, the debit card he gives to the clerk didn't say Superman on the bottom. It said Clark Kent. When Superman monthly had to pay the overpriced rent on his tiny little urban apartment in Metropolis, the lease agreement at the bottom didn't say Superman. It said Clark Kent. Superman had to pay his own way in this world. He did it as an underpaid newspaper reporter. Superman had a 9-to-5. That's what allowed him to do everything else that he did with his time. So understand then, when Superman decides to fight off the evil horde of space mutants or foil Lex Luthor's latest scheme to take control of the world, he's doing it on his lunch break. Again, it's Superman's choices that make him a hero, not the powers. Specifically, it's the choice of how he chooses to spend his free time and his free resources. After work, instead of grabbing the remote control, he grabs the cape. Instead of grabbing the iPad, he grabs the cape. Instead of grabbing the new electric guitar he just bought, he grabs the cape. There is a lesson here. If you want to be a forgettable person, do nothing but serve yourself with your spare time and resources. But if you want to be a hero, invest some of that time, some of those resources, serving others. Now, I realize in many ways, some literal ways, I'm preaching to the choir this morning. The fact that y'all are here this morning, sitting in a UU church on a Sunday when you could be fast asleep, watching TV, playing video games, it says something about you. There's a reason we all come to church. It's because we haven't given up on the world. We haven't given up on the human race. And we haven't given up on ourselves. We choose to recognize and appreciate the vast beauty of this world because it is a beautiful world, except when it's not. Sometimes it is a dark and chaotic and frightening world, but we refuse to allow the darkness and the chaos to paralyze us with despair. We refuse to recoil from human contact. We refuse to run away and put our heads in the sand. We refuse to simply cultivate our own personal gardens. We refuse to join Tarzan in the jungle. Instead, we choose to stay in the city. In so doing, we help fulfill the promise of our third principle. We grow spiritually. We save ourselves as we help to save others and allow others to save us. Do you remember that little secret I told you about earlier? I think you guys have been pretty good. So here it is. I'm Superman. And so are you. Someone, somewhere, at some time, will need you to do this. They will need you to be Superman. So will you turn a deaf ear and a blind eye? Or will you grab your cape? When we choose to engage the world and live our values, we become superheroes. Conversely, when we turn away and allow the darkness to win, we become a part of that darkness. So my charge to all of you this morning, go grab your cape. Blessed be.